Take a moment and think back to the last time you felt a strong emotion take over. Maybe frustration in traffic, anxiety before a big decision, or anger during an argument with someone you care about. In that moment, did you feel like you were in control, or did the emotion feel like it was controlling you? This is the question at the heart of emotional intelligence, one of the most studied and most practical areas in modern psychology. Emotional intelligence isn't about suppressing feelings or pretending to be calm all the time. It's about understanding what's happening inside us and learning how to respond rather than simply react. Research suggests that emotional intelligence has a measurable impact on nearly every part of life, relationships, career success, decision-making, physical health, and even longevity. People who understand and manage their emotions tend to communicate more effectively, recover more quickly from setbacks, and build stronger, more stable relationships. And the encouraging part is this: emotional intelligence is not a fixed trait you're born with. It's a skill, one that can be learned, practiced, and strengthened over time, much like a muscle. Over the next half hour, we're going to explore what emotional intelligence really is, why our emotions behave the way they do, and most importantly, how we can apply practical, research-informed strategies to manage them in everyday life. This isn't about becoming emotionless. It's about becoming emotionally skilled, calm in the storm, clear in the chaos, and steady in the moments that matter most. Let's begin. Chapter 1: What emotional intelligence really means. The term emotional intelligence often gets used loosely, sometimes as a synonym for being nice or easygoing. But psychologically, it refers to something much more specific. Emotional intelligence generally includes four core abilities: recognizing your own emotions, managing those emotions, recognizing the emotions of others, and managing relationships effectively using that emotional awareness. Consider a workplace example. Two employees receive identical critical feedback from a manager. One immediately feels defensive, raises their voice, and walks out of the meeting frustrated. The other notices the same flash of defensiveness rising in their chest, takes a breath, and instead asks a clarifying question. Same trigger, same initial emotional spark, but very different outcomes. The difference isn't that one person felt less emotion. Research suggests both likely experienced a similar physiological stress response. The difference was in what happened next: the ability to notice the emotion, name it, and choose a response rather than be hijacked by it. This is the essence of emotional intelligence, not the absence of feeling, but the presence of awareness. Psychologists often describe this as the gap between stimulus and response. That gap, even if it's only 2 or 3 seconds, is where emotional intelligence lives. The wider we can make that gap through practice, the more choice we have in how we act. It's also worth noting that emotional intelligence isn't about being positive all the time. Anger, sadness, fear, and frustration are not flaws to be eliminated. They are signals carrying information. Anger often signals a boundary has been crossed. Sadness often signals loss or unmet needs. Fear often signals perceived threat. Emotionally intelligent people don't ignore these signals. They listen to them, then decide how to act with intention rather than impulse. Chapter 2: The biology behind our emotional reactions. To manage emotions effectively, it helps to understand what's actually happening in the body and brain when we feel them. This isn't just abstract theory. Understanding the biology can make emotional reactions feel less mysterious and more manageable. When we encounter something stressful, a sharp comment, an unexpected bill, a near miss on the road, a small almond-shaped structure deep in the brain, often referred to in psychology as the brain's alarm center, activates almost instantly. This structure's job is to detect threat and trigger a rapid response, often before our more rational, reflective thinking has had a chance to weigh in. This is sometimes called being emotionally hijacked. Heart rate increases, breathing quickens, muscles tense, the body prepares to fight, flee, or freeze. Here's the important part. This reaction is fast, but it is also temporary. Research in psychology and physiology suggests that the intense physical surge of an emotional reaction, the spike in heart rate and stress hormones, typically begins to subside within about 90 seconds if we don't feed it with more anxious thoughts. The problem is, most of us do feed it. We replay the conversation, rehearse comebacks, imagine worst-case scenarios, and that initial 90-second wave turns into 20 minutes, or 2 hours, or an entire restless night. Think of a parent who feels a flash of anger when their teenager comes home late without calling. The first wave of frustration is automatic and biological. But what happens afterward, whether that parent paces the room rehearsing an angry speech, or takes a few slow breaths and waits for the wave to pass before speaking, determines whether the conversation that follows is productive or damaging. Understanding this biological pattern offers something valuable: permission. Permission to feel the wave without judging yourself for having it. And the knowledge that if you can simply ride it out without reacting impulsively, it will pass on its own. This single piece of knowledge, that emotional surges are temporary, is one of the most practically useful insights in emotional psychology. Chapter 3: Naming emotions to tame them. There's a concept in psychology often summarized as name it to tame it. Research suggests that the simple act of putting a precise label on an emotion can reduce its intensity. When we identify and articulate what we're feeling, whether silently to ourselves or aloud to someone else, brain imaging studies suggest there's reduced activity in the brain's threat response centers and increased activity in areas associated with reasoning and regulation. This might sound almost too simple to be useful, but consider how it plays out in real life. Imagine someone sitting in a waiting room before a medical appointment, feeling a vague, uncomfortable tightness in their chest. If they simply sit with that vague discomfort, it tends to grow, becoming a formless cloud of unease. But if they pause and silently name it, "I'm feeling anxious about what the doctor might say," something shifts. The emotion becomes a specific, nameable thing rather than an overwhelming fog. It becomes something they can examine, rather than something that consumes them. This is why journaling, therapy, and even simply talking to a trusted friend about a hard day tend to be so effective. The act of converting a swirling feeling into words, sad, embarrassed, disappointed, overwhelmed, envious, gives the rational part of the brain something concrete to work with. A practical tip here: many people default to vague, general words like bad, stressed, or off when describing how they feel. Building a richer emotional vocabulary, distinguishing between, say, irritation and resentment, or nervousness and dread, tends to improve this naming process significantly. The more precisely we can identify an emotion, the more effectively we tend to manage it. A useful daily practice is simply pausing 2 or 3 times a day and asking yourself, "What am I feeling right now, specifically?" Not good or bad, but a more precise word. Over time, this builds the kind of emotional self-awareness that forms the foundation of emotional intelligence. Chapter 4: The pause between trigger and response. If naming emotions is the first practical tool, Learning to pause is the second, and arguably the most important. Picture a common scenario. You receive a short, curt text message from a colleague or friend. Within seconds, your mind starts spinning a story. They're upset with me. I must have done something wrong. Maybe they don't respect me. Your thumb hovers over the keyboard, ready to fire back a defensive reply. This is the moment emotional intelligence is built or lost. Research suggests that one of the most reliable ways to interrupt an automatic emotional reaction is through controlled breathing. When we slow and deepen our breath, particularly extending the exhale longer than the inhale, it activates the body's natural calming system, the parasympathetic nervous system, which counteracts the stress response. A few slow breaths can be enough to shift the body out of high alert and allow the more reflective parts of the brain to come back online. A simple and widely used technique involves breathing in for a count of 4, holding briefly, and exhaling for a count of 6. Doing this even 3 or 4 times during a moment of emotional intensity can meaningfully reduce the urge to react impulsively. Beyond breathing, creating physical or temporal distance also helps. This might mean stepping outside for a few minutes before responding to a frustrating email, or simply telling someone, "I want to think about this before I respond. Can we talk in an hour?" This isn't avoidance, it's regulation. Giving the nervous system time to settle before engaging allows for a response shaped by intention rather than impulse. Consider a manager who receives blunt, critical feedback from a client in a video call. Reacting immediately might mean becoming defensive or dismissive, but pausing, even mentally, for just a few seconds, taking one slow breath before responding, often results in a calmer, more constructive reply. "That's helpful to hear. Let me look into this and follow up with you." The situation is the same. The outcome is shaped entirely by what happens in that pause. Chapter 5: Reframing, Changing the Story We Tell Ourselves. Emotions are rarely caused directly by events themselves. More often, they're shaped by the interpretation we assign to those events. 2 people can experience the exact same situation: a cancelled meeting, a delayed flight, an unanswered message, and have completely different emotional reactions, based entirely on the story they tell themselves about what it means. This is the foundation of a well-established psychological approach known as cognitive reframing. The idea is straightforward. If our thoughts shape our emotional response, then learning to notice and gently challenge unhelpful thought patterns can change how we feel, not by denying reality, but by considering it more accurately and completely. Take the example of a friend who doesn't respond to a text message for several hours. One interpretation might be, "They're ignoring me, they must be upset with me." This thought is likely to trigger anxiety or hurt. But a more balanced interpretation might be, "They're probably busy. I'll hear back when they have time." Both interpretations are guesses. Neither is confirmed. But research suggests that the interpretation we choose to believe has a direct and measurable effect on our emotional state, often well before we have any actual evidence either way. A useful practical habit is to ask 3 questions when a strong negative emotion arises from an ambiguous situation. What is the evidence for this interpretation? Is there another way to see this? And what would I tell a friend who was in this exact situation? That third question, in particular, tends to be surprisingly effective. We are often far more compassionate and rational when advising others than when evaluating our own circumstances. Reframing isn't about forcing positivity or ignoring legitimate problems. If a real issue exists, it still needs to be addressed. But separating the actual facts of a situation from the anxious assumptions layered on top of it allows for a clearer, calmer, more accurate response, and often prevents unnecessary emotional suffering over situations that may not be what they first appeared to be. Chapter 6: Emotional Intelligence in Relationships. So far, we've focused largely on managing our own internal emotional world. But emotional intelligence also plays a critical role in how we relate to others, and this is where much of its real-world value becomes visible. A core component here is empathy, the ability to genuinely sense and understand what another person is feeling, even when they haven't explicitly said so. Empathy isn't simply about being agreeable or kind. It's an active skill of attention, noticing tone of voice, body language, and context, and using that information to understand someone's internal experience. Consider a common situation. A partner comes home from work visibly quiet and withdrawn. One response might be to immediately ask, "What's wrong with you tonight?" A question that can feel like an accusation. An emotionally attuned response might instead start with observation. "You seem a little quiet tonight. How was your day?" The difference in language is subtle, but research in communication psychology suggests that the way we open a conversation about emotion strongly shapes whether the other person feels safe enough to open up, or whether they become defensive and shut down. Active listening is another central skill here, fully focusing on what someone is saying without mentally preparing your response while they're still speaking, and reflecting back what you've heard before offering your own perspective. A simple phrase like, "It sounds like that was really frustrating for you," can make someone feel genuinely heard, often more than any advice or solution that follows. It's also worth noting that emotional intelligence in relationships includes appropriately expressing your own needs and boundaries, calmly and clearly, rather than through passive silence or explosive confrontation. Saying, "I felt hurt when that happened, and I'd like to talk about it," tends to lead to far more productive conversations than either bottling up frustration or lashing out impulsively. This balance, between empathy for others and honest expression of your own emotional needs, is often what distinguishes healthy, resilient relationships from strained ones. Chapter 7: Building Lasting Emotional Resilience. Emotional intelligence isn't built in a single dramatic moment of insight. It's built gradually, through small, repeated practices over time. This final chapter focuses on how to turn the ideas we've discussed into lasting habits. The first practical foundation is consistent self-reflection. This doesn't need to be elaborate. Even a few minutes at the end of each day spent reviewing emotional high and low points, what triggered them, how you responded, what you might do differently, builds the kind of self-awareness that makes future emotional regulation easier. Over weeks and months, patterns tend to emerge. Certain situations, certain types of comments, certain times of day where emotional reactivity tends to spike. Recognizing these patterns in advance allows for preparation rather than surprise. The second foundation is physical regulation. It's worth remembering that emotional control is not purely a mental exercise. It's deeply tied to the body. Research suggests that adequate sleep, regular movement, and stable nutrition all meaningfully affect our baseline emotional resilience. A person running on 4 hours of sleep is simply more likely to react sharply to a minor irritation than the same person well rested. Taking care of the body is, in a very real sense, taking care of emotional stability. The third foundation is practice under low-stakes conditions. Just as an athlete doesn't wait for the championship game to practice their skills, emotional regulation techniques, breathing, naming emotions, pausing, reframing, are far more effective when practiced regularly in small, everyday moments, rather than attempted for the first time during a major crisis. The driver who practices patience in minor daily frustrations, like a slow checkout line, builds the same mental muscle needed for far more significant emotional challenges later. Finally, it's worth acknowledging that setbacks are part of this process. There will be days when old patterns resurface, when frustration boils over, when a sharp word is said before it can be caught. Emotional intelligence isn't about perfection. It's about a general, gradual trend toward greater awareness and steadier responses over time. Self-compassion after a setback, rather than harsh self-criticism, tends, according to research, to support faster emotional recovery and more consistent long-term growth than self-punishment does. As we close this exploration of emotional intelligence, it's worth returning to where we began. Emotions themselves are not the problem. They are an essential, deeply human part of how we experience life, how we connect, how we protect ourselves, how we know what matters to us. The goal was never to eliminate them. What we've explored instead is the space between feeling and acting, the pause, the breath, the chosen word, the gentle reframe. That space is where emotional intelligence quietly does its work. It's not loud or dramatic. It often looks like small, almost invisible choices. Choosing to listen a little longer, choosing to wait before responding, choosing curiosity over judgment, both toward others and toward yourself. If there's one thought to carry forward from everything we've discussed today, it might be this: you are not your emotions, and you are not separate from them either. You are the awareness that notices them, and the choice that follows. That awareness can be cultivated, gently and patiently, day by day. There's no need to master all of this at once. Perhaps tomorrow, you simply pause for one extra breath before replying to something frustrating. Perhaps you try naming a feeling more precisely than you usually would. Small steps, repeated consistently, are how lasting emotional skill is built, not through force, but through patience. Thank you for spending this time in reflection. Wherever you are, and whatever you're feeling right now, may you carry forward a little more steadiness, a little more clarity, and a little more compassion for others and for yourself.